in sustainable development. We're celebrating our 6th anniversary with a very special guest. We, over the past 6 years, were privileged to bring to Serbia a number of inspirational speakers, including Jeffrey Sachs, Neil Ferguson, Joseph Nye, and now it is my immense honor to represent in front of you a good friend, first and foremost, a person who I met many years ago, and we kept seeing each other in many parts of the world, and once he promised to me to come to Belgrade. But this is not his first time. Actually, this is his second time. He was on a big railroad trip from Scotland to Istanbul. Yeah. And actually, there was only one part on this route that he couldn't do by rail. Unfortunately, it was in Serbia. but that's when he promised to come for the second time to talk about something entirely different. But before we dive into the discussion, let me say a few words about Parag Khanna. He's a founder and the managing partner of Future Map, a data and scenario-based strategic consultancy. It's a firm based in Singapore. After receiving 2 degrees from Georgetown University and a doctorate from the London School of Economics, he has gone on to hold distinguished positions at a number of prominent international institutions. Council on Foreign Relations, Brookings, University of Singapore, University of Toronto, amongst many others. He remains a frequent contributor to CNN, to BBC, to Al Jazeera, and many other world stations, a very well-known face around the world. He's written a number of columns for the Wall Street Journal, for Financial Times, for Washington Post, the National Interest, and last but not least for Horizons, the journal of our think tank. He was named a Young Global Leader by the World Economic Forum, and he now sits on the prestigious Global Agenda Council of the World Economic Forum. He was named one of the 75 most influential people of the 21st century by the Esquire magazine, and he is the recipient of the OECD Future Leaders Prize. Of course, he authored a number of books, including The Second World in 2008, How to Run the World in 2011, and Connectography, 2016. And this brings us to his latest book, The Future is Asian. But before, let us welcome Parag Khanna to Serbia.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
So it's a very interesting title of the book, The Future is Asian. This morning I had a meeting with a European ambassador, and this wasn't the smoothest meeting of all. It wasn't related to this, but in the end of the meeting I asked the ambassador, oh, by the way, do you want to come for this very interesting book launch? He says, like, what is the book? I said, Future is Asian. And he thought I was kidding him. But let's start by asking first, what is Asia? Because when you say Asia, most of people think about the Far East.
Right.
And in this country in particular, the first association is China. But what is Asia, Parag, in your view?
It's a great question. It's the question I started with. But first, let me thank you, Vuk, for hosting me here, and to the center, of course, for doing such a marvelous job with the translation of this book. I'm honored to be part of the distinguished series that you have created, and I really appreciate your friendship and your time in bringing me here, and to all of you for being here this evening. It's actually my third visit. My very first book had a whole chapter on Serbia, but it wasn't translated into Serbian. But I was looking at the geopolitics of emerging markets, and that was actually my first road trip through here was more than 15 years ago. So I've been following, this region and this country, rather closely, and really, admired from afar and up close. So I'm very delighted to be back. But so to shift the radar, the periscope, to the other side of the world, what is Asia? And right towards the beginning, I say most people don't know what Asia is, even in Asia. The word Asia is an ancient Greek word, and it referred to Persia, because that was all that was known of the lands to the east back then. Asia itself is so big that Asians never really needed a word for themselves, because they also thought of themselves as the whole world. And each Asian civilization, like Japan or China, India, the Southeast Asian civilizations, is geographically so vast. Remember that all of Europe would fit comfortably in Southeast Asia, which is one corner of Asia. So Asia is indeed much bigger than China. So I'll just show you this map here, right? For, no two geographers, no geographer disputes what Asia is, right? Asia stretches all the way through Anatolia, Turkey, the Red Sea, in other words, the Arab countries of the Gulf. That's Asia, right? You may call it the Middle East, in English at least, but in geographical terms, it's West Asia. Most of Russia is in Asia. So this is the full Asia. But for 20 years, we've had lots of books about Asia, right? You've had scholars come here, friends of ours, who've written about Asia. But ultimately, if you take one of those books, any one of them, that may be, let's say, 300 pages long, 298 pages are about China. And the other 3 billion people, right? The other 3 billion people get about 2 pages, right? But there's 5 billion people who live just here in Asia, 5 billion. And only 1.4 billion are Chinese. So, needless to say, there has been overemphasis on China to the expense of everything else. What I want to do here, so instead of having a book that's 98% about China, I made this book 48% about China. There's plenty of China, right? But what about everyone else? And how do they fit together? And so what's interesting is not just the geography, because now we get it. It's what I call the system, the Asian system. Now, the word system has a very specific meaning in international relations. It means when the units, the countries, when their relations with each other are more intense, trade, war, diplomacy, they could be fighting with each other. Europe has been a system for thousands of years. And for most of those thousands of years, Europe has been a war-like system, a conflictual, violent system. So a system doesn't have to be peaceful, right? But we know Europe is a system. Your relations with each other are tighter than your relations with Latin America or Asia, right? When we talk about Asia, we never talk about it being a system, right? Because for 500 years, the last 500 years, these countries have all been basically divided from each other because of colonialism and the Cold War, right? Two things, 500 years of colonialism and the Cold War. But for the last 30 years, the Berlin Wall fell 30 years ago, almost today, right? November 9th, 1989, that's almost 30 years ago in 1 month, right? Soviet Union collapsed, 1991. So for 30 years, though, Asia has been growing back together. It's becoming more and more of a system. So that's the other thing about it. They don't just share a geography. They're sharing trade networks. Let me show you here. You can see the infrastructure projects that are linking Asia together more and more, right? So Asia is growing together. So I wanted to explore that as well. But so again, point being, what is Asia? It's 40-something countries. It's 5 billion people. It's 50% of global GDP. It's a lot bigger than just China. But China has benefited from the rest of Asia, and we have to appreciate that as well.
But you say in your book that in many ways the symbolic onset of the Asian century is the 2017 meeting in Beijing,
right?
The Belt and Road Summit,
right,
that was hosted by President Xi. And there are increasing discussions about a Belt and Road. This think tank held a number of discussions and had a number of publications about the Belt and Road. And I remember in the year 2015 when the Belt and Road was launched. At the time it was called OBORD, One Belt, One Road.
Right.
But when Belt and Road was launched by the Chinese in 2015, everybody felt very enthusiastic about it. And it was good news and everybody wanted to join this discussion, and it was the hottest topic. And everybody was almost universally positive about it. Now, what happened in the last 4 years that this has become so much mired with controversy?
Right. Well, it has grown despite the controversy. So let's look at the number of countries that have joined or signed an agreement with the Chinese Ministry of Commerce to be part of Belt and Road. It's now about 100 countries, right? Now let's look at one agent of Belt and Road is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, right? The AIIB. I couldn't fit the names of all the countries that have joined the AIIB. You know very well, as a practitioner of multilateral diplomacy, this is the fastest growing multilateral institution in human history, right? Is the AIIB. It has like 80 or 90 members, and it was just founded a couple of years ago. Now, you may not be able to read it, but Iceland, Chile, I mean, all of these countries that are not even contiguous to Asia want to be part of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Many European countries obviously have joined as well.
But not Japan. But not Japan.
Well, not Japan. But so here's the thing. The project of building this Asian system through infrastructure began before China's Belt and Road, right? Like I said, it began exactly 30 years ago with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. Remember, I said colonialism and the Cold War separated Asians from each other. The end of colonialism and the end of the Cold War allowed Asians to stitch themselves back together. So that process has been going on for 30 years, driven by Japan, Japanese money, Japanese corporations, Japanese construction crews and equipment, right? Financed by the Asian Development Bank. Even the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development has a very big portfolio of projects of electricity and energy in Central Asia, in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. So it's been going on, but why 2017 as the date where you would say this is the beginning of the Asian century? Because then that was the date that China brought pretty much all Asians together. Not Japan, but as a formal member, but to coordinate, or to at least better coordinate, all of those infrastructural activities. So China is contributing to something that's been going on for 30 years, and now it's the biggest contributor to what's going on, but it's not the only contributor. Now India is stepping up. I was in Brussels last week. The EU and Japan have decided that they're going to start doing more sustainable finance initiatives around infrastructure. The US has created something called the US International Finance and Development Corporation, IFDC, right? That is also going to contribute. So everyone is practicing what I call the infrastructure arms race, right?
Is that just to counter China right now or not?
Well, so on the one hand, it is portrayed from the outside as countering China, right? China wants to lend to this country, so I'll lend to that country, or China's lending here, so I'll try and offer a better deal. It's all part of, however, it all contributes to the broader process of connecting Asian countries to each other. The difference being, who are you borrowing from? What are the terms of those loans? That may differ, and there'll be competition there. But who benefits from competition? The principles are exactly the same as when you walk into a supermarket, right? You can buy lettuce and tomatoes made by this producer for this price, or another producer for another price, and so forth. Actually, it's the same thing. A marketplace is good. And what's happening right now in this infrastructure arms race is that the choices that countries have are not just Japan, not just China. It's going to be lots of players. And the winners are all of these countries that are participants. So I again resist the idea that just because China started something or is a big player in something, that it will dominate. Because you can already see with Belt and Road the pushback against the way in which China does Belt and Road. However, you still see a growing membership of Belt and Road, because fundamentally the idea of connecting countries is a good thing. the only debate is how should we do it? But everyone agrees it's a good thing, and that's why the membership of these organizations keeps growing, and that's why Europeans, yourselves, have been joining. Italy just joined Belt and Road, for example.
So how optimistic are you about China and about China's economic trajectory and basically everything else, including military?
Well, as you know, you all watched partially on TV, 2 days ago, the 70th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. So it was a big moment for them, obviously. They've come a long way in 70 years. No one disputes that. I would say the real date to look at, though, in terms of, there wasn't necessarily that much to celebrate in terms of China's socioeconomic development in 1949, right? Not until 1979, right? So to me, the Chinese story, the miracle, really begins. The China becoming a superpower, that story, really begins in 1979, because that's when Deng Xiaoping decided to open the economy partially by allowing special economic zones in places like Shenzhen, and that's when China really took off. So, China's made these amazing strides in 40 years, and in purchasing power parity terms, right? In other words, the cost of goods in the local currency, China's already the biggest economy in the world by a couple of $1 trillion, right? So you don't expect a $22 trillion economy in PPP terms to be growing at 10%, right? So I think, look, China, I like to say this it's not a joke. I say every problem in China is the biggest problem in human history, right? It's technically true, right? And so, but as someone, my job is to go to countries and see everything that's wrong with them. You may not like what you read in my first book about Serbia, because again, my job is to see the flaws in everything. But of all the countries that I go to,
it's good that you're not writing the book today.
Yeah,
so it's fine.
but you can.
Going back to Asia.
So, so with a place like China, just like any other place, I show up with sheets of paper, single spaced, 10 of them, of what are you going to do about this? What are you going to do about this? You're aging. You've got an environmental crisis. Problem this, problem that. Your debt is massive. But China's the only country, truly the only country, where if you're telling them about a problem they have, they actually know that. You don't have to tell them. Right? They thought of it way before you did. They are aware of the problem. Every problem.
Well, it's such a point like
and they have a strategy.
Obviously, one big problem for which there may or may not be a strategy. I mean, it doesn't look like a very sophisticated strategy, at least for now. But obviously, it's burning, and it's about Hong Kong.
Yeah.
It's obviously a very difficult moment there. So, how do you see this developing, and where does this end with Hong Kong?
I'm not an apologist for China by any stretch of the imagination. But what if what's happening right now is obviously not to Beijing's liking? They would have preferred all of this be quiet. But the truth is that they have had a strategy. Now, it's definitely hit some ugly bumps in the road, like what's happening right now. But let's be clear that they've known the handover was coming since the 1970s and 80s when they negotiated it. In 1997, 22 years ago, they regained control. They have been pushing mainland Chinese people in at a very significant rate, at nearly 150,000 per year. So no, not quite actually. So from 1997 to now, 1.2, 1.3 million new mainland Chinese citizens moved into Hong Kong legally, according to the terms of the agreement. You've had a lot of rewriting of regulations and laws and codes. It's been, you might call it death by 1,000 cuts, right? And what's happening today is a response to the fact that in 2014, during the Umbrella Revolution, which was the last time mass demonstrations, and I was there in Hong Kong at the time. I spent one night just walking around in 2014 in the Umbrella Revolution, and those students saw that the demands were not met, right? It was business as usual for the last 5 years, so they're saying, we know better. We know you're not going to give us the freedoms that we want. You're not going to allow us to maintain our autonomy. So they're fighting back now, and to the bitter end. But, again, we may not like this. I certainly don't think it's fair. And I think that if I were a ruler in Beijing, I would have handled it differently. But if you go, I've been to Hong Kong 3 times in the last month. And, there are scenarios, but there's very, not plausible pathways for that trajectory of China eventually sort of smothering it more and more to change.
So let's now move to a country which you also know very well, given your background, the second largest in Asia, which is India. And why is it that India is so much behind?
Yeah.
And is India going to stay behind during the Asian century? What do you think?
And the best thing for India is to not compare itself to China. In India there is a joke about how Indians are swelling with pride about their present growth rate and accomplishments. And Indians, of course, as you can tell, we talk a lot. But when an Indian goes to China and comes home, he's mute for 2 weeks. It's the joke in India because they're basically speechless, right? Because they think they're so great until they go to China, and then they're really just blown away. And a lot of people actually have that experience when they go to China for the first time, not just Indians. So it's best for India to focus on how to be a better India, not how to compete toe to toe with China. Now, obviously, demographically, they're effectively equal now in population size. They're about 1.4 billion people. In India, you can't even really have a proper census, so they don't actually know how many people are in India, but it's roughly the same as China. We do know that the median age is a lot younger, more than 15 years younger than China. So that's a big difference between them. So in terms of longevity of the pathway for growth based on demographics, that's in India's favor. But the political system, in a way, works against it, right? Because if the pathway to growth, whether you are a democracy or dictatorship, if the pathway to growth is, specialization of economic clusters, attracting large volumes of foreign investment, investing heavily in R&D and building a world-class educational system, and if we made a list of these things, how does a country succeed? We would say, yes, you should do these things. And it doesn't matter if you're authoritarian or democratic. These are invest in human capital, right? That's not a provocative thing. That's a good thing, right? And China has done all of these things that every country should do. And you see India falling way behind. And the most recent university rankings just came out. There's not one Indian university in the top 100, right, in the world, right? It's embarrassing. And then, of course, it's not that democracy gets in the way, it's ineffective democracy. It's democracy where the needs and the will of the people are not translated by a strong state. So India has democracy, that's wonderful, but it does not have stateness, right? China has stateness, the capacity of the state to do things. Up until the Modi government came in, the federal budget of India was like roughly similar to Norway, right? Just to put it in perspective, to show you how powerful New Delhi is. Now Modi is changing that, and the process of building state capacity in India to make a whole that is greater than the sum of the parts is a 20 or 30-year process.
And do you see this somewhere along the way, frictions between India and China?
There are many frictions between India and China. And by the way, again, it's a sign that Asia is becoming more of a system, that neighbors are starting to actually have frictions. They can't ignore each other anymore. There may be war, there may not be war. 2 years ago, there was a major military standoff between India and China in the region in the Himalayas by the border that they share with Bhutan. And it's a very interesting episode in which China, with its Belt and Road projects, this is more domestic because they're building across Tibet. And in that region, it trespassed in this disputed area. And up at that high altitude, they had a major standoff. And to everyone's surprise, even though China is way more powerful than India, the Chinese backed down. Not because they couldn't win, of course the Chinese could win. So why did they back down? Well, because China has 14 neighbors, 14, and India is just one of them. So if it defeats India, the other 13 neighbors are going to start to put up walls and say, hey, now we're afraid of China. China is beating up on its neighbors, right? China has spent 25 years building some amount of goodwill on how it resolves border disputes with countries like Russia, with Kazakhstan and others, and tried to be careful about not its maritime disputes. As
yeah, I was about to say.
Let's put that off to the side. Maritime disputes it has not handled diplomatically. Terrestrial disputes it has handled pretty well. Border commissions, negotiations, actually giving away territory to smaller countries, things like this, right? But India has been an exception, right? So in this standoff now, what happened is that not only has India gained confidence from seeing China back down, but now other countries are studying this episode as an example of how you can also, even if you're a smaller, weaker country, you can sort of stand up to China. So India has momentum going for it militarily. It's making big investments in its navy in the Indian Ocean. Economically, it's now completed road projects of its own that give it more confidence in the mountainous regions as well. But ultimately, Indian power will be projected in the Indian Ocean, and Chinese power will be projected more in Central Asia and Russia and so forth.
So if there's one single thing that worries you most about Asia, what would that be?
The list can either be really long or really short, because there's so many countries, so many challenges. We should talk about, I'll say a few things that are not blind spots, but again, just so that you understand how vast the scale of Asian problems is when you're talking about 5 billion people. A, inequality. We talk about inequality all the time in Western societies, right? The inequality level or the Gini coefficient in a country like Serbia or America or Germany might be 2 to 1, right? The gap between the highest median wage earner, and the lowest, depending on this province or so on. If Asia were a country, even just Southeast Asia, right? If you were to compare just Singapore, where I live, versus Myanmar, right? The gap is not 2 to 1 or 3 to 1 or 5 to 1. It's 40 to 1. So inequality, right? Asia has crazy rich Asians, like you've seen the movie. Maybe you've seen the movie. I don't know if it was aired here. But it's got more than 2 billion very poor people. So let's not forget that. So that's an issue, right? But I generally see a lot of pragmatism. There's a lot of fiscal investment going into infrastructure and connectivity.
But is this inequality growing or is it shrinking right now?
So again, inequality is a statistical fact when you're creating a 1 billionaire every day, right? Or something crazy like that is happening in Asia in terms of the wealth creation. So of course you're going to have high inequality. The question is, are you mitigating poverty? And they are, right? But how about climate change? How about a big issue there, right? That's as big a challenge for Asia as any of the outstanding geopolitical disputes, right? Is climate change. If you look at the number of people in Asia exposed to rising sea levels. Now just think about your imagery of Asia today very often are these gleaming megacities with their skyscrapers, right? And people bustling around and everything is hyper modern. All of those cities, each of them may have 20 million, 30 million, 40 million people. Guess what? They're all located on the Pacific Ocean coast or Indian Ocean coast. And these are tropical latitudes. Where are sea levels rising the fastest? The tropical latitudes of the world, right? So big problem. You may have heard that Indonesia is planning on moving its capital city, right? Now, Jakarta has a lot more people than Serbia. Jakarta has a lot more people than the entire Balkans. Okay, I need to explain. We need to have some perspective here, right? The entire population of the entire Balkans region would fit inside the city of Jakarta.
That is about to move.
That's about to sink into the sea, and yes, therefore they have to move it. So that's the scale of problems that the environment represents.
But what about security problems? If you were to pick like one potential security issue that worries you most in Asia, what would that be?
I want to talk about a few of them, but I want to be clear that we often look over there and we see crazy, irrational leaders like we portray Kim Jong-un or even Modi in India, Hindu fundamentalists or Pakistani Islamic nationalists, and we think they're crazy. They can be kind of crazy, but they're not irrational when it comes to these things. And the proof is that, again, in the last 30 years, you've had all of these World War III scenarios. Taiwan could have been World War III by now, right? South China Sea, North Korea, China and Japan have disputes. China and India have disputes. India and Pakistan have disputes. There are many major war scenarios in Asia. In fact, all of the major war scenarios in the whole world are all in Asia, right? So there's no, but has World War III broken out yet? Not in the last 30 years. So give Asians a little bit of credit. So that's context, right, for your question. So North Korea. Right? North Korea is actually taken a positive direction. Right? I mean, all the parties are talking directly to each other face to face. They're saying at this point, except for America, everyone is saying, even if you keep your nuclear weapons, we want to find a way to peacefully integrate you as this reclusive, isolated country into the Asian economic and diplomatic system. And I think it will happen without war, right? In the South China Sea, there's a negotiation right now where the Philippines and China might agree to do joint exploration for oil and gas and to share the revenue in a way that benefits the Philippines more than China, which is a compensation for China illegally building these islands, right, and fortifying them militarily. So, they're finding ways to compromise with each other. It may not look fair from a legal standpoint. I'm talking to a former very senior United Nations official here. So, genuine diplomatic arbitration has been ripped up, right? But as you also know, you're talking about a part of the world where sovereignty is not the natural state of affairs, right? Sovereignty in terms of, modern borders and international law has kind of been imposed through colonialism and 20th century diplomacy on the region. They think in more sort of fluid terms, if you will, right? So I think that the Hague arbitration, didn't even get as much attention in Asia as in the rest of the world because we have a legalistic mind in the West, and they are less legalistically inclined. So they can find ways to barter territory, to share resources, to get around these disputes. They can. I'm not saying they will. You can have war. So the subtitle of this book is Commerce, Conflict, and Culture in the 21st Century. I'm not even remotely in denial about all these war scenarios. I live there. I'm personally exposed to them. I'm at the front lines in some ways. But most of them, there is a way out, and I see leaders incrementally walking in that direction.
And would you agree that the same logic, this optimistic logic, if you will, that the same applies for the Gulf? Because their situation seems to be really escalating with Iran in particular.
Right. So again, I don't want to be optimistic. I may be an accidental optimist. I'm trying to be impartial if one can. I'm trying to be fair. I'm looking at the recent history and I'm seeing that, the worst case scenarios have been avoided in many of these situations. So if that's the definition of optimist, fine. I'm an optimist. But I think it's unfair to be overtly pessimistic and to assume that the worst is going to happen, right? So that especially applies in the case of Iran, where, look, you could have war tomorrow, but this is not the first time that there's been a serious, tension and altercation. I served as an advisor in the U.S. military in Iraq and Afghanistan on either side of Iran. I've seen Iranian activity in those countries. I know what the repercussions would be if there's a direct attack on Iran in terms of what Iran would do in its response. And because each of these conflict theaters, as we call them, right, the sort of Iraqi, Syrian, Jordanian, Lebanese situation over here, and the Afghanistan-Pakistan situation over here, the Straits of Hormuz situation here, and then Iran itself, these are all connected, right, geographically. There is no geographic distinction between these conflicts. You attack Iran, all of them blow up. And of course, there's no way for the United States. The United States can pull the trigger, but then who cleans up the mess, right? And it affects American allies.
Yeah, but America pulled trigger in the past.
Yes, but the reason history doesn't repeat itself as much as we think it does or would is because we know that, right? And we ideally overcompensate, with an abundance of caution. Sometimes it means that we're fighting the last war, right? We're trying to avoid repeating a past mistake, so we are blind to other mistakes. That's what happens in finance all the time, right? In financial crises. The next financial crisis is not going to look like the last financial crisis. We're busy trying to prevent the last financial crisis from happening again, but ignoring the next one. You can have that in geopolitics too, but right now you don't have to think very far ahead to see that the negative repercussions of bombing Iran are worse than the benefits of bombing Iran.
Yeah, but the thing is, what do you see as a trajectory out of the escalation? Because what you have right now is Iran has obviously no way to get rid of the U.S. sanctions.
Right.
There is no way that the Americans, they have introduced sanctions that cannot be removed, as a matter of fact.
Right.
Politically speaking, if you go to the Congress and if you try to remove the sanctions in the U.S. system, and especially in the House of Representatives, you're never going to have the majority required for the removal of these kind of sanctions.
Right.
And these kind of sanctions hurt very much.
They do.
So,
how'd
you get out?
Yeah.
If they go back to the fully blown nuclear program, and one can make an argument that they have no reason not to, especially after the United States withdrew unilaterally from the agreement.
Yeah.
So they continue with this, they continue being under sanctions, and people start getting terribly worried, starting with Israel.
Totally.
So how'd you get out?
So this is not what you would call a diplomatically mature region, the Middle East, the Gulf, right? This is a very petulant region. We know how the leadership of these countries deals with each other or doesn't, right? So, there isn't necessarily much reason to be optimistic in terms of them agreeing. But the ideas have been out there for a while, proposed not just by Iran, which they did last week, but also by even Gulf countries to have a Gulf Security Conference, right? Where you actually have a regional mechanism that involves Saudi Arabia and Iran, even Israel, right, into some kind of, to create some kind of a strategic equilibrium in the region. Turkey, obviously, as well. Russia would play a role. And if they can come back to the table and have that conversation. Now, again, it's not going to happen now. You're absolutely right. It's not going to happen given Saudi's position. It's not going to happen given America's position, right? But again, the last 40 years, right, the U.S. has tried to isolate Iran. It has not brought down the regime. It's not working now, even with the sanctions being as strong as ever. So even if it takes 5 more years of achieving nothing, eventually, I think, the forces of opening Iran, like commercially, diplomatically, are ultimately going to prevail, right? The question is only, does that happen before there is a serious military escalation that involves either ships in the Straits of Hormuz or a renewal of conflict in Iraq, right, which is certainly a scenario as well that's not to be discounted. And if that happens, that will change the path that Iran is on in terms of how the U.S. deals with it, how Gulf countries deal with it, and so on. So we would have to reevaluate at that point.
So let's turn the question the other way around, going from problems to to hopes. If you were to name the top 3 players in Asia on which you'd be willing to place the longest bet, which would those 3 countries be?
It's a fantastic question. So it depends on what, we're betting on them for, right? So for example, a lot of people have counted Japan out. Japan is just forgotten sometimes in strategic, conversations, even economic conversations. It's considered a country in demographic decline and so forth. But that's a very stale way of looking at Japan. Japan is actually reinventing itself. Japan is obviously the most technologically sophisticated large country in the world. It's a place where, in a way, you no longer think about the society as being just human beings because of the role of robots and automation in the country. And in fact, despite the indigenous demographic decline, it now is the 3rd largest country in terms of recipient of migrants in the world, behind the United States and Germany. It's remarkable. So you've got more than 300,000 people arriving in Japan every single year. It's an enormous number of new migrants. A lot of them are actually Chinese, which people don't think would happen, but in fact they do. Vietnamese, Korean, Indian even. So Japan is really trying to overcome.
And you don't have those problems like in Europe with the migrants, with the Chinese, Han Chinese coming.
And I'm really glad you raised this, because unlike European countries, such as yourselves, again, that are smaller populations, remember that even Germany would count as a very small population in Asia, right? The largest country in Europe has a population the same size as the Chongqing, Chengdu cluster of China, right? Just, again, perspective. Therefore, there is less cultural insecurity, right? So a country like Thailand, a country like Indonesia, a country like China, a country like Japan can have millions of foreigners, but it's still going to be Japan, right? You're still going to have to learn to be Japanese. You can't have an enclave of Sharia law in Japan. I mean, these places have very deep, rich cultures. They're not, and this is why Asians have not had those major wars of conquest other than Japan in the mid-20th century, which obviously failed, right? Because unlike Europeans, where you actually have a lot in common culturally, and you could genuinely believe that you could conquer your neighbors and make them be like you, in Asia, Indian people are not going to become like Chinese people. It's never going to happen. You can't actually conquer a civilization, right? You can conquer within a civilization, which is what you in Europe have been trying to do for a long time. But
or one can make an argument that that's what China's doing in Xinjiang.
Well, so this is it's an important case, but the law of numbers doesn't apply when you talk about Uyghurs. That's only 20 million people, sadly, right? I mean, very, very sadly. And I've spent quite a bit of time there and written about it as well. And again, that's been a slow motion, sort of eradication of their way of life for a long time. I've been going there for more than 15
But going back to the positive, so Japan is one.
So Japan is reinventing itself. And again, it's a place that it doesn't. I don't want to say it benefits from climate change, but it's a very livable country, right? Sort of topographically and so forth. Vietnam, to take the opposite end of the economic spectrum. There's out in Asian economics, we have this kind of line these days. We say the trade war is over and Vietnam won, right? So neither the U.S. nor China wins. Vietnam wins, right? And Vietnam is a country that I've been writing about for a long time, and I tend to, like I said, I'm very harsh in my judgments of countries. And when I wrote about Vietnam 15 years ago, I was very positive. And I underestimated Vietnam even then. Its accomplishments have been amazing, right? And now it's in this sweet spot where actually, you can see it here. So Vietnam's in that right in the middle circle there of the Venn diagram. These are the countries that are participating in every single trade liberalization agreement, right? Trans-Pacific Partnership, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, ASEAN Economic Community. So if you want to open trade, Vietnam will open trade with you, right? That's a smart policy. So where is everyone moving their supply chains? Vietnam. Where is labor cheap? Vietnam. Where can you export from to everywhere? Vietnam, right? So, so I would say they're going to continue to find it. Obviously, very disciplined country. People have been calling it Little China or Little East Germany, you know, for a long time. It's also, again, a very pleasant place. Again, remember, it's also an authoritarian communist country. So with very slow social liberalization, right? But it is also a place where you find this, you know, proud and humble at the same time national ethos that realizes that they have this very important chance, and that you find this cohesiveness of society to work together to build a great country of the future. So I am a believer in Vietnam as well.
So, I mean, generally you are very optimistic about Asia. And if the future is Asian, then what does it mean for Europe? Does it mean that Europe is past if Asia is future?
Right. You know, this was a big debate when we were titling this book, and it's not my title, but I think it works. But you know, it gives this impression, though, that Asia is the future and everything else is the past. But my argument structurally in geopolitics is actually that, you know, I mean, for the first time in history, I think I have a slide here at this. Yeah, here. You know, for the first time in history, we actually live in a truly global multipolar system, right? North America, especially the United States, is still a superpower region. It's never not going to be, right? I personally believe in Europe very strongly. And you know, it's very hard in America to be pro-European or to make the argument that Europe is still a globally relevant power. Believe me, it's a very lonely argument to make. I still believe in Europe very strongly. And then you have Asia as well. So the rise of Asia is really about Asia taking its place alongside Europe and North America. Not eliminating you, not stepping on you, not destroying you, not conquering you, not surpassing you. It's about, in a way, reinforcing this global multipolarity, right? So that's where we are in terms of the global history. So where does it leave Europe? I mean, so this is very propitious. I mean, the most important number on this slide is this. 1.6 trillion. It's the largest number on this slide in terms of trade volumes, right? Europe trades more with Asia, the largest and fastest growing region of the world, than it does with the United States. That's only 1.1 trillion, right? So the transatlantic era is sort of giving way to the Eurasian era, which is very good for Europe. You share Asia, you share Eurasia with Asia. And you've got 1.6 trillion in trade now, and that's with very few free trade agreements, right? Just ratified the Japan agreement. Eventually there will be one with Southeast Asia, right? These countries. Eventually there'll be one with India. Eventually China will open its markets more. And as it does, this number, 1.6, that's going to become 2.5 trillion, 3 trillion, right? So you should view the rise of Asia as something that's good for Europe. You need to be selling into Europe. This is why many European countries have, you know, started to realize that they kind of want to become like Germany, right? Germany has this huge export volume to Asia, right? Not just to China, but all across Asia. And that's something that other, you know, countries want to have. That's why Italy joined Belt and Road, for example, right? So whether it is Britain after Brexit, whether it is, you know, France, Italy, Germany, the Nordic countries as well, because of the Arctic shipping routes that are opening, all of European countries are developing. And you hear, of course, in Serbia, you know, with the
I was about to ask, like,
inbound investment. Every European country has an Asia
strategy. Situation that, I mean, Serbia and the rest of the Western Balkans is just on the border of Europe. And for various reasons, this process of European enlargement in the Balkans has been stalled, and we'll see how quickly it can be restored. So what is your recommendation to us in the Balkans in the context of what you were just describing?
So I would say two things. One is a recommendation to Brussels and how it deals with the Balkans, and the other is for you yourselves. For you, one of the things that I've observed for years in how China, expands its leverage is that there are countries. If you're a smaller economy, if you're dependent on foreign investment and borrowing from abroad, and if a lot of your exports go to China, if a lot of your investment comes from China, you can find yourself a bit trapped. And what's very important to do is to sort of diversify your sources of foreign capital. Don't allow your industries or sectors to be captured too much by China. And this is something that Mongolia has learned, and Myanmar has learned, and Kazakhstan has learned, and now countries in Africa are learning. So it's important to position yourself as being open globally to all investors. So that obviously requires rule of law, economic diversification, investment protection, and actively recruiting that investment. So that obviously Serbia has to do a lot of work in this regard, rather than just being China's bridgehead into Europe. It's not bad to be China's bridgehead into Europe, right? If the world's largest economy with deep pockets wants to help you modernize your infrastructure, wants to sell you hardware and software that can help you accelerate the growth of your services industry, that is not bad, but you have to use it to your full national advantage in a utilitarian way, and you have to avoid being captured as a result. And it is possible to get that balance right, and that's one thing you have to do. Mm-hmm. For Brussels, and this is something I was saying last week in Brussels at the signing of this EU-Japan agreement, was stop demonizing and ostracizing the Balkan countries like Serbia, right? Because after 2008, right, of course, when the SAA agreement started to weaken and the adjustment assistance came down, stabilization funds, that opened the door to support, right, from China that the EU used to provide. And so I actually, in Brussels, I gave them a warning. I said, in the way geopolitics works is competitive connectivity. If the European countries are going to abandon you, others are going to come along. So I think that Europe has to view the Balkans, as a gateway region, right? A gateway region to high growth markets of West Asia and East Asia, and to kind of rebuild those ties. It's a two-way street, obviously.
So when we touched upon Europe, I'm going to ask you something that not necessarily has to do directly with Asia. Do you think that Brexit is going to happen?
I think Brexit has happened, right? Because ultimately it's about the distortion and the diversion effects, and those have already kicked in. I mean, X billions of dollars are lost every single day in, capital that would have been invested. Now you have British companies leaving. So Dyson, one of the most famous British industrial firms, has relocated its global headquarters to Singapore, right? Ironically, led by James Dyson, who was supporting Brexit, right? Mm-hmm. So then you've got all the foreign investors, the Asians, who are saying, well, we were going to do these big projects in England because it's been a great gateway into Europe, but now it's not going to be. So now we'll relocate those operations onto, to Luxembourg or the Netherlands or Germany, France, Switzerland, whatever. So in a way, Brexit has begun. Brexit, the slow motion Brexit, it's quite fast paced, the negative impact on the UK. Obviously, my decisions on migration, where is talent going and so forth. So to me, Brexit has begun. It's been happening for a long time. And it will never be reversed is almost an equally important answer to the question. You can't reverse the negative effects unless you suddenly change your migration policy and become a market that's so big that it's worth being in for its own sake, even if it's not an EU member.
And do you envisage the UK staying in these borders in the next 10 to 20 years, the current borders?
No. I mean, I can imagine, obviously Scotland splitting and joining the EU. I can imagine Northern Ireland rejoining Ireland. All of these things are possible. And not only a lot of Irish people in there. Serbian Irish, excellent. Quite a novel combination.
Irish or Serbian.
So, I can fully imagine these. Here's the thing. There is this, I mean, especially, here in this region, you can sympathize. Nationalism is a very powerful force, right? And you should never take for granted. I mean, my intellectual obsession is borders, right? This is what I've been looking at for 25 years. So never underestimate the power of people to want to self-govern, right?
Mm-hmm. So let me then ask you another tricky question. Who do you think is going to stay longer in office? Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping?
Xi Jinping.
Xi Jinping.
Yeah.
And how long is long?
Well, it might be close. So if Putin doesn't get ousted by the protests that are already quite significant in the country, I mean, you can almost predict when Russian protests are going to happen because it's a function of economic downturns, low oil prices, one scandal or the other, this kind of thing. But he seems to he's weathered those storms before over more than a decade. But he could ride it out till 2024-ish. And Xi Jinping's next term is going to be around then, he could midstream hand over. Here's the thing that they have in common, because they don't have much in common, obviously. China is much more a state than Russia is in terms of, again, stateness and capacity. But what I do see happening in Russia is that there is this next generation of kind of technocrats. They don't make the news, right? They're low-key figures, but they're Western educated. They've been given these portfolios around infrastructure, around managing transportation projects, new industry areas, agriculture, the Far Eastern regions, right? Oil and gas, redevelopment, the Arctic. A lot of what Russia can do with itself to maximize its potential in a good way is finally being done by people whose names you've never heard of, who are not household names, who are not oligarchs, who are not kleptocrats. They're just bureaucrats with good education. So there is hope that Russia can sort of steer itself in that direction, and there's a group of people, and you could imagine Putin handing over to a couple of them. With China, it's just much more clear, because you could fill the next 75 years of Chinese leadership with qualified professionals.
But do you think that there is going to be a succession in China anytime soon?
But no, I mean, the thing is, it doesn't matter when, because you already more or less know who, right? I mean, you have the Central Standing Committee of the party.
But that was until this constitution was changed.
Yeah, it's changed, and he's definitely shuffled the deck faster. He's definitely also brought in people who were not slated in the traditional pathways to climb the ranks, and brought them. But the thing is that once you do, you go through an incredibly intense training process, right? I mean, to govern China the way the Central Committee does, the 7 individuals, then the broader rings and circles of the Politburo, leadership and advisory, these 20 and then 100 and 200 and 1,000 figures, even if they've been in their positions for 1 or 2 years, the amount of governance experience and exposure you have to how to govern is absolutely extraordinary, right? It's much more preparation in a short amount of time than pretty much any figure in a Western liberal democratic society has. It's more than Barack Obama had. It's a lot more than Donald Trump had. It's more than the next generation of German leadership has. And Germany is by far the most, significant state in that regard. You have a lot of inexperienced people at the top in Germany right now. And you don't have that problem in China.
So if the People Republic celebrates its 100th anniversary in 30 years from now, do you think that at that moment Taiwan is going to be a part of the one China state, or is it going to be something like it is today?
Right now, we use this phrase, one country, two systems, right? And then kind of Taiwan is off to the side. But in Taiwan, they basically say it's actually one country, three systems. Hong Kong is its own sort of thing that's kind of being absorbed. And Taiwan has been in this slow motion process of absorption commercial colonization, Finlandization, for decades, right? Even with the recent U.S., renewal of significant defense commitments to Taiwan, or at least arms sales to Taiwan, the Taiwanese leadership is very cautious. Even the nationalist parties don't change the flag, declare independence, or do any of the things that they used to say they would do. So whether it's the nationalists or other parties across the spectrum in Taiwan, they're pretty consistent. So they're going to find their own way. I cannot tell you what it will look like in 30 years, the relationship, right? I can't. It's no longer a situation. We used to say more optimistically, Taiwan is so successful that it will teach China how to be a liberal democratic state. Obviously that's not going to happen. I didn't say that, but that was a conventional wisdom. But there's still a lot to be gained from the status quo in terms of them mutually sort of dealing with each other commercially, and also sort of demographically. And I think that both sides basically realize that that's what they should maintain.
So the last question before we turn over to the audience for questions to be asked. Who, in your opinion, is today the world's strongest leader?
Strongest leader. Well, I mean that's obviously would be Xi Jinping in terms of his sort of stability, how entrenched he is. You'd be surprised to know who the world's most popular leaders are. But in democratic societies where you can actually run these kinds of polls, which therefore excludes China, but it's Modi of India and it's Duterte of the Philippines. And when we look at them, what we see are provincial, nationalist thugs, right? Basically, is kind of how they're often described, not very charitably. But by any public opinion measure or survey, they're the two most popular leaders on the planet Earth. So clearly, if you want to understand Asia, even if you believe that the world should be, fully democratic societies, I certainly do as well, but you would be well served to understand them from the inside out, from the bottom up. That's obviously what I try to do, is to say, hey, you may not like it, but try to understand it. Why would Filipinos, why are 100 million Filipinos rabidly, sort of behind this guy, even though he's so thuggish, right? Well, there's reasons, for that.
Well, thank you, Parag. And now I'm going to give you the chance to ask questions. Please. It's just the microphone's going to come to you.
Mihajlović, Core D magazine. It's an annual magazine about diplomatics and certain things, but I would like to ask you about your opinion about religion issue in Asia. And did you treat that question in this book?
Yep.
And also, what do you think about that question, speaking of Europe? Because all these migrations and actually
Great questions, yeah.
make changes in terms of that question. And if you can give us your opinion, not about diversity of religion in Asia, but what is the most influent, actually vivid person in that term? And
right. Well, remember that again, Asia has a half dozen major civilizational clusters, right? And every religion is represented very powerfully across Asia. There's hundreds of millions of Christians. There's nearly 1 billion Muslims, and so on. Obviously, Buddhists and Hindus as well, and so forth. But they tend to be geographically isolated, right, from each other. The Philippines is mostly Christian, obviously. India is mostly Hindu, and so forth. There are areas where they overlap, and nationalist movements or ethno-nationalist leaders are exploiting those differences. That's part of the reason why you have the Rohingya crisis in Myanmar, for example. But by and large, religious conflict does not define Asia, right? Again, you have micro episodes. In a place like Indonesia, there was a very controversial moment in the last election for the mayor of Jakarta, because there was, religion came into the picture because, there was issues about Christianity versus Islam and whether blasphemous statements were made, and it became a big national issue. But again, Indonesia is the largest Muslim country in the world, and you can clearly see that the governance of Indonesia has almost nothing to do with Islam, right? Now, there's obviously rising, sentiment that relates to religion, but by and large around the world, not just Asia, we see that religion as a force does not know how to govern a territory, right? So I don't worry too much about that, that issue, quite frankly, in it. Even where you have this Hindu nationalism in India, there's limits, right? Even with all the Hindu nationalism that you have in India, by 2050, India will be the largest Muslim country in the world. There'll be more Muslims in India than there are in either Pakistan or Indonesia, right? So, even with a figure like Modi, you just can't change the size, the demographics, right? On Europe, I have a chapter in this book called Why Europe Loves Asia But Not Asians, right? And obviously it's talking about this refugee issue and crisis with all of the, for you they're Arab, but mostly they come from Asian countries, right, geographically. But actually what I see happening, and this is what I've documented, is the rising number of South and East Asians in Europe. Now, when I was living in Germany, I went to high school in Germany in the 90s, I was like the only Indian that I knew in thousands of kilometer radius. Today, if you go to Berlin, Hamburg, Frankfurt, you not only see all the Turks, but you've got, and of course Arab populations, but huge numbers of Indians and Chinese and Vietnamese, right? So South and East Asians are really increasing their presence across the board in Europe, and it's obviously very critical for plugging the labor shortages, right, in the tech sector and so forth. So I kind of show you industry by industry why this could be a very good match, right, for Europe.
Thank you. Two more quick questions, please.
Thank you. I read Connectography when it came out, and I was struck first on how optimistic it was. All these connections are being made. There's, in the first chapter of the book, it's about all these infrastructure projects that are still just on paper. And I was struck by what I was thinking about the future, which was ecological problems, and how long can we keep going with all this infrastructure building, making connections, free trade, when resource use is so rapid? And what is the most optimistic scenario, and what is the most pessimistic scenario, in your view on ecology?
Good question. I'm pretty clear in the book that infrastructure and connectivity is one of the main enablers of ecological destruction, right? So, it may seem, again, like an optimistic book in the sense that connectivity brings these aggregate benefits, in terms of material wealth and distribution around the world. But I'm also pretty clear that if you weren't building roads in the Amazon, it would be harder to destroy the Amazon, right? So I'm trying to be balanced here. But when it comes to optimism versus pessimism on this, look, if you believe, let's take as a point of departure that we are past the point of no return, and Bill Gates just said this a couple of weeks ago, he's like, 2 degrees Celsius rise would be an optimistic scenario, right? It's likely to be worse. So that means that there's pretty substantial downside effects and volatility now built into the global kind of, ecology. So that means, though, that infrastructure is going to have to serve a whole new purpose, which is to enable migration. We're going to have to develop, new geographies, new habitats, maybe in the Arctic regions, Canada, Russia, and so forth. And I wrote about Canada and Russia in that book, talking about how it's kind of a perversity that you have the two largest countries in the world that are so demographically depopulated, that have the fastest growing agricultural sectors in the world. In fact, the final map number 46 in that book, was the map of global agriculture if you have a 4 degrees Celsius temperature rise. And it turns out that all the world's food will be produced in the Arctic regions of Russia and Canada where there's no people. But my point in that was to show, look at the mismatch between natural geography, right, of agriculture, political geography of borders, functional geography of infrastructure, and human geography of where people are, right? These four geographies, right, of nature, of politics, of infrastructure, and of people, do not well align right now. We live in a very illogical world when you're trying to make the most of it. So if you ask me for an optimistic scenario about how, with the present leadership that we have in the world today, how are we going to align these four geographies to everyone's benefit? We're not, right? We're only going to have one by one countries that maybe get their act together. You look at a place like Canada that's saying, you know what, we have 30 million people, we should have 100 million people. So Canada has a strategy, like Canada 100 million. Russia doesn't have that strategy, as you know, right? So migration is, as you very well know, the first and last preserve of sovereignty, right? So many other aspects of globalization countries can no longer control. Can't control your financial markets, can't even control your laws because other forces are interfering in your judicial systems. But you want to protect your borders when it comes to people. And so ultimately we will only get there incrementally.
So one last question, because he has to run to the airport.
I'll try to be quick. My name is Miloš Pavković. I'm a political science student here at the Faculty of Political Science in Belgrade. First question is about environment in China. We can see that there is a problem with air pollution in China. We can see pictures of people wearing masks in big cities. So how China will deal with this problem in the future? Mm-hmm. And second question would be also about China and the security problem with these cameras. We saw it in Hong Kong. So what can be potential consequences of misuse of these cameras? And because we have it also here in Belgrade.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, I think in both of your questions, you were kind of phrasing in the future tense, but it's already happening, both of them. I mean, if you look at China and pollution, you know, remember, if you go to Beijing today, the air is much cleaner than it was 5 years ago. I just went running in Beijing like a couple of months ago. I was like, wow, you know, compared to a few years ago. So but that's also because they've pushed pollution out in some ways. They've shifted the location of certain manufacturing activity. They have cleaned up, right? They're still building a lot of coal-fired power plants on the one hand, but they've also cleaned certain industries or eliminated industries or transitioned the energy supply in others. It depends on the sector and it depends on the province of the country, basically. But they are doing something about it on the whole, but you know, not enough. Again, every problem in China is the biggest problem. Their problem is less pollution now, air pollution. That's India's, you know, India's much worse than China now. But parts of China are still very bad, of course. But now their problem is water. So when you think about China and environment, the much bigger challenge for them is just water, the drying of rivers, the need for adequate water supply. So one of the biggest infrastructure projects in the world right now is the west to east, south to north water diversion project in China. So that's something to watch. And then on facial recognition and security cameras, you know, this is, actually in fact, it's just become mandatory in China that this is just, I think, this week. Every time you purchase a mobile phone, you're photographed as the sort of purchaser of that phone. And now everyone has a phone, everyone replaces their phone. So you'll absolutely have every single person in the country, you know, facially, you know, cataloged. So that is obviously, you know, and they can do a lot of things with that, good and bad. You know, I mean, it gets to the broader issue on social credit system and so forth. We could talk forever about it, but the social credit system has some positive effects because it's an accountability mechanism. It's harder for companies to commit fraud that hurt people because you will get complaints and you'll be shut down, right? So people forget that's a positive thing. But then there's terribly negative effects when you think about political manipulation. But you're not going to stop China from doing what it's doing.
Now you're giving too many clues to some people here. So I'm going to stop you there. Before
defer to the president.
Before we go on any further, I'm just going to announce that the winners of a special version of Parag's book with a signature are Maja Sinđević, Dušan Borković, and Anja Vukoje. So these are the lucky winners of the book. just to congratulate you. And we're going to have a picture with Parag just outside. But he really needs to run in order to catch a plane to somewhere. Before we thank Parag, I just want to say that we are going to continue with these discussions and being intellectually broad. Our next speaker is going to be someone ideologically not identical to Parag. It's going to be Professor John Mearsheimer from the University of Chicago, but a big name, and we're very proud to have him as the next speaker. We translated, after The Future is Asian, we translated The Great Delusion, Liberal Dreams and International Realities. So stay tuned. It's going to be the first week of December for Professor Mearsheimer's visit in Belgrade. For me, this was a truly fascinating discussion. We covered like such a wide range of things in geographies. I apologize if we were like switching too fast between different topics and different parts of Asia and the world. But I really believe this was one of the most fascinating conversations we had in Belgrade recently. So join me in thanking Parag.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Now everybody's invited to the cocktail. Unfortunately, Parag's not going to be with us because he's got to run. He's got to dash off to the airport.
Thank you, my friend.